First case study is about the Affordable Care Act, which is also called Obamacare. This content closely follows the book America's Bitter Pill, which I think is possibly the most important policy book I've ever read. And also, this is really going to orient you towards a lot of things in healthcare because you can't really understand the solutions until you first understand the problems. And so this will lay a nice foundation for us to understand healthcare for future things that we learn about. So the book is mainly broken into three sections, which cover the passing of the law, the initial implementation of the law, and then the rescue effort to fix the failed rollout of the implementation, ending around the spring of 2014. In real life, multiple things were happening at once, but I grouped these slides into themes to make them easier to follow and discuss. So the first section of the book is about getting the law passed. Major reforms like this only happen when the political stars align, which is very rare. A big challenge was the so-called original sin of American healthcare, and that was during World War II, there were wage controls, but the Wartime Labor Board exempted employer contributions to healthcare from the controls, not treating them as income. The IRS later extended this logic and made employer-sponsored health insurance non-taxable. And this locked the employer-based system in, especially since labor unions would go on to fight to keep strong provisions that they negotiated for their members. That kind of locked some stuff in path dependency style. Then back in the 1990s, Bill and Hillary Clinton tried to reform healthcare, but their effort got torpedoed by the industry's successful TV ads. Those ads featured an old couple called Harry and Louise who, really wanted to keep the government out of their healthcare. And those ads, Harry and Louise, became infamous as a cautionary tale of industry's power to oppose reform. By 2008, enough, things were building up in terms of like high costs and coverage challenges and all of that, a lot of pain points. And so both parties were looking at Massachusetts's Romney Care model, which protected people with pre-existing conditions, in part by requiring everyone to get insurance and subsidizing low-income people to help afford the insurance that they would then be required to get. In the Democratic primary, fun fact, Hillary Clinton supported the individual mandate, but then Obama opportunistically attacked her for it, claiming at the time that he didn't think an individual mandate was necessary. He, even at the time, kind of privately conceded they probably would need it, but that's politics. Is sometimes you just opportunistically attack your opponent. Then in late 2008, the economic crisis hit, and Democrats ended up kind of sweeping a lot of their congressional races. And so the stage was set for reform. Even with the basic contours of a Romney Care-like approach, there were still countless policy trade-offs to make, and each one had its supporters and its opponents. And Democrats had just barely enough votes to pass something if they were all able to agree on something. But that made navigating these issues hard. So this slide here is pretty deliberately overwhelming because healthcare is like 17% of the US economy. So there's a very wide surface area of policies to discuss. And this slide here doesn't even capture all the policy fights, even those covered in the book. That said, let's look at a few here. The primary goal was to allow everyone to buy health insurance, even if they had a history of pre-existing conditions that made them more likely to cost insurers money. To make the insurance markets make sure they don't collapse from people just waiting until they get sick before buying insurance, there would be a mandate that would penalize people if they didn't buy insurance in advance. That way, the markets would have lots of customers. And to help people afford the insurance, the government would give subsidies to people. But many progressives also wanted a public option insurance company that didn't have a profit motive, which could then compete against the insurers. The companies, unsurprisingly, hated that idea. Insurers were also worried about so-called age band limits on how much more they could charge older people than younger people, because it would either make insurance too expensive for the young or too like not worth it to cover older members. If you could only charge like say a 2-to-1 ratio, you would either drive the young people away or you wouldn't be able to recoup your costs on older members. Democrats also wanted insurers to cover some essential basic stuff like ambulances, emergency care, other sort of obvious basic things, but they left the specifics of which benefits to be decided as a regulation by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, HHS. Obama wanted the bill to be deficit neutral, so they needed to find taxes and fees to offset the costs. One idea was a tax on expensive employer-sponsored healthcare, and this was deemed the Cadillac tax. And although economists liked it, labor groups hated it. Even little details like whether young adults could stay on their parents' plans until they were like 26 or so, or who would run the marketplaces that would be formed and regulated and subsidized, who ran that. Even those little details sparked intense fights. The list goes on, and Congress debated these issues and more throughout all of 2009. So let's zoom in on a couple of the fights to get a little bit of texture. So the Senate wanted to avoid another round of Harry and Louise ads. So they met with representatives from major industries, including hospitals, insurers, pharma, and medical device makers. And you can read the book to understand for each of these different players, what were each of their incentives and how were they, thinking about whether this bill was good or bad. But pharma, their top priority was to make sure if this bill passes, they wanted to prevent the government from negotiating drug prices, and they want to prevent allowing cheaper imports of drugs from Canada. The Senate Finance Committee agreed that they would take those reforms off the table in exchange for discounts and rebates totaling $80 billion over 10 years as a way to help achieve the deficit neutrality that President Obama was interested in. When the details of this deal became public, progressives in the House were very angry and they threatened to blow the whole deal up. But without it, Pharma was ready to spend millions in advertising and campaign attack ads to destroy the law just as they had in the past. Another fight showed how fragile the ACA consensus was. In the Senate, Democrats had just enough votes to overcome a filibuster, but only if every single senator stayed on board. That meant any one senator could and did demand their price. To win over holdouts, Senate leadership infamously promised extra Medicaid money for Nebraska and Louisiana, whose deals were called the Cornhusker Kickback and the Louisiana Purchase, respectively. Another moderate senator, Joe Lieberman, publicly said he'd block the bill, he'd kill it if it included a public option or even if it included Medicare buy-in for older Americans. And so just like that, in order to get the bill to the finish line, the Senate version of the bill didn't have any public option, unlike the House version, which did. And, there were many such fights like this, and the whole thing was a bit of a bitter, tenuous mess. The only way that the law passed was by having enough Democratic senators to overcome a filibuster, and that means 60 votes. Back then, Democrats won races in states like Missouri, Nebraska, West Virginia, Louisiana, Montana, and more. But their 60-vote majority, even then, didn't last very long. So after winning a lot of races in 2006 and 2008, they started the year with 58 Democratic Senate votes. But then a Republican switched parties, and then a Democrat won a recount in Minnesota. And so they got up to 60. But two of their senators were both very sick. So the Democratic senators, after a lot of negotiations, they passed their Senate version of the bill in the fall. Because it was very different from the House version, they were going to need to hash the differences out between the two chambers and then pass the new negotiated version, again requiring 60 votes. But Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts died, and then surprisingly, a Republican replaced him and won his seat. And just like that, the 60-vote majority ended, and any possibility of clearing the filibuster for this hashed out version with the House kind of went out the window. So it seemed like that might be the end of the effort, but Obama and Pelosi kept fighting. They twisted House members' arms into passing the exact same version as the Senate bill, and that way the Senate didn't need to pass any kind of modified version. They had already passed that version. And then after that, they used a 50-vote process called reconciliation to tweak and add a few touch-ups to the health insurance system to make it a little bit more palatable for progressives in the House. But just like that, the ACA was the law of the land. So what even made the cut from all these negotiations? So this is the same table that we saw earlier as a reminder. And here we have some of the results. So we got that core, the three-legged stool of pre-existing conditions, mandate, and subsidies. The insurance age bands were 3 to 1, and there was also a limit on how profitable health insurance companies could be with this medical loss ratio requirement. Pharma successfully avoided Medicare negotiating prices and also successfully avoided importing drugs from Canada. Joe Lieberman single-handedly killed the public option and the Medicare buy-in for people over 55. The Cornhusker kickback and the Louisiana Purchase were actually both revoked in reconciliation because their votes weren't needed. There was already 50 plus or more votes without them. Moderate Democrats in the House, they really insisted that the bill needed to restrict funds so that they didn't pay for abortions. But since that couldn't be modified in the Senate bill, Obama promised them that he would do it with an executive order later on. And then a few other things too, as we can see. But after all that work, they finally got it over the finish line. And as Joe Biden was caught saying on a hot mic, that this was a big effing deal. But a law that's only on paper doesn't mean anything. So, like last year, Congress passed a TikTok ban, but the current administration is just lawlessly ignoring it. Or when I was in grad school, we fought for and won free therapy sessions for graduate students. But when I reached out to make an appointment, they didn't have enough staff, so I had to wait like 4 months. So paper victories don't really mean much if you don't help people. So did the ACA help people? We're going to need to see how it was implemented. So what needed to be done? Aside from expanding who was eligible for Medicaid, the other big increase in coverage came from creating marketplaces where people could purchase regulated insurance plans with their subsidies. These marketplaces would be government-built websites called exchanges. The Senate bill allowed each state to build their own exchange, but most of them opted not to, which meant the federal government's website would be the largest place for people to buy ACA plans. It might sound easy, but writing all the rules and regulations for the ACA was anything but smooth. This figure shows a bunch of regulations and when they came out, including dotted lines that I kind of estimated that are used to show how much wasted time there was because of delays between when it maybe could have come out and when it actually did come out. So some of the first regulations were rushed out in a timely manner. That included some simple things like kids on their parents' insurance until they're 26 and defining essential health benefits to cover. The lead regulator was a progressive academic, and she also moved quickly on canceling as many inadequate plans as she could by 2013 so that more people had to buy the regulated, robust plans. But many key rules were delayed, sometimes because they were just too complex, like the medical loss ratio took a little while to implement, or because hospitals, were maybe seen as less villainous than the health insurers, and so there was less urgency. So, for example, Senator Grassley got a provision into the bill that would stop nonprofit hospitals from using aggressive bill collection tactics, and that could have prevented patients as soon as the law was signed in March of 2010, but it took over 3 years to write the regs for it. And in that meantime, hospitals kept going after poor patients using predatory tactics. But that wasn't the only reason that some regulations were slow to arrive. For the first half of 2012, the White House told regulators to take their time. Republicans were suing to try to overturn the law on the grounds that Congress didn't have the constitutional authority to fine people who failed to purchase health insurance. The case went to the Supreme Court, and in the meantime, the administration suggested to the regulators to wait until the ruling came out in the summer. But then in the summer of 2012, that was the thick of campaign season where Obama was running for re-election against Mitt Romney. The campaign wanted to avoid making any negative headlines. So for the rest of 2012, the regulators were again taking their time on rulemaking, going kind of slow. Also, as an aside on that Supreme Court case, when the Supreme Court narrowly decided to uphold the law 5-4, they did, however, knock out mandatory Medicaid expansion. So now, rather than all of the states expanding Medicaid, each state got the chance to decide not to. And the upshot of this was that millions of Americans in red states were left out. And not only that, but the law was written assuming that everyone less than 138% of the federal poverty level would get Medicaid. And so those people weren't given any subsidies because it was assumed they'd go on Medicaid. But when Medicaid wasn't an option for them, it didn't mean the subsidies kicked in. So now these people who are, maybe you make 110% of the federal poverty level, which for an individual, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but maybe it's like $20,000 a year. I don't know, give or take. You can't get on Medicaid, but you also can't get any subsidies to purchase the health insurance that you're mandated to get. And so it really put a squeeze on those people in particular. That said, eventually, um, uh, insurance companies, as this whole process was going on, they were getting pretty frustrated with the slow pace of rules. They needed answers on things like smoking surcharges and risk adjustment and other regulations like that. Because without those, it made it nearly impossible to create plan offerings or to set prices in a timely manner. And yet, despite all of these delays and hurdles, the regulations were not the part of the ACA implementation that ended up going pretty horribly wrong. So let's talk about building the Federal Exchange website. Back in 2010, economist David Cutler and a couple other people wrote a memo recommending appointing a dedicated exchange CEO within the government to run things, like create this position for someone in charge to kind of coordinate and orchestrate this. But instead, the administration put the project under CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. At the time, many of the policymakers who hadn't built something like this before, they maybe didn't see what the big deal was. And some of them were particularly skeptical of economists and of the private industry. And so this meant that CMS, already a huge bureaucracy, was tasked with building and overseeing the website. And that meant relying on contractors and some fragmented testing. The main hub was going to be at CMS's Office for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, or OCIIO. But it had to coordinate with all sorts of other CMS offices, things like technology, procurement, insurance, and more. But then after Democrats lost the House in 2010, they were worried that Republicans, still opposing the ACA, might try to defund the OCIIO. So they buried it deep within the bowels of CMS, and they ended up demoting it to a center to protect its budget. Now, called the CCIIO, the leader was outranked by all of the leaders of the other offices that it was going to need to coordinate with. And it became so disempowered that the center cycled through 4 different directors before the website even launched. A senior Obama official later admitted that in hindsight, once OCIIO became CCIIO, implementing Obamacare became pretty much impossible. And that's not really a headline kind of finding, but understanding how all of these bureaucratic dynamics play out and how they can determine the success and failure of things. It's a really valuable lesson to learn, and we'll see why. Also, things didn't really get any less confusing as time went on. Just before the launch of the site in 2013, there was a journalist doing a piece about the sort of unspoken heroes behind the build. So he interviewed 8 officials about the creation of the website. And just during the interview, he asked who's in charge. And then later on at the end of the day, he's going through his notes and he realized that 8 people gave him 7 different names. And that included like, oh, the head of HHS are in charge, or no, or it's the director of CMS, the deputy CTO of CMS, the White House, the head of CCIIO got 2 votes. And then there was another, name or two. He also asked if he could see the website's command center during the go live of the website. And they replied to him with like, oh, which one? Because there were up to 5 command centers scattered across CMS, HHS, and maybe the White House. They were still trying to decide. And all of that spoke to the lack of coordination and leadership. There were more missed opportunities. For instance, in March of 2013, the HHS CTO convinced the secretary of HHS to bring in McKinsey to do a review of how things were going. McKinsey flagged many big problems, including that there was no single decision maker, unclear authority, not enough time for end-to-end testing, and unrealistic deadlines. But leaders kept reassuring each other that things were under control, fixes were going to be happening, and so there was no large change undertaken to try to right the ship. And unfortunately, this isn't going to be the last time that we see where turf wars prevented information from flowing to the proper people that could fix things. But it's just a website, right? Like, how hard could it be to build? Like, couldn't I do that in a couple days? So, first thing we need to do is talk about government procurement. It's broken. Just like ask anyone, they all hate it. There are so many rigid rules to comply with that the only firms that bid are a small number of usual suspects who I've heard arguably specialize more in bidding and compliance than they do in technical expertise. And as an extra step to guard against sort of corruption and cronyism, there are additional mechanisms in the government to contest an awarded contract if one of the losing firms wants to hold things up. So to avoid that drawn out process, which can delay things up to a year, CMS went with a contractor that they already had on retainer through this relationship called IDIQ, indefinite quantity, indefinite delivery. Uh, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. um, uh, so they went with a vendor that they already have. Unfortunately, that vendor wasn't necessarily the best there was to offer, but that's how it can go when you're operating under some constraints like that. Um, Other vendors were procured too. Though it was a very big project broken into like 50 subcontracts across 30 vendors. Unfortunately, even with the vendors in place, there were issues with the specifications that those vendors were given. So those contracts, their contracts are usually very specific in these kinds of instances. So the reason why is that I guess we don't trust the vendors to just design something reasonable because, well, what if they decide to display something like for the insurance plans, which of them are giving extra benefits like free healthcare or free generic medicine or other things like that. Because then you could get some insurer that doesn't offer those benefits, and they might challenge this design decision as the government site being overly coercive about benefits that aren't required. So to avoid like those kinds of hypothetical headaches and all of that, contractors follow very prescriptive business requirements and specs, with the idea being that the public officials, they're the one accountable for this. They should be designing this. So you can see the logic there. But as a result, the contracts needed to be very prescriptive and specific. And unfortunately, the specs weren't fully written. We already saw that there were a lot of delays in writing the regulations, both because of the complexity and also because of politics, and this caused further delays. There was another design decision that we're going to see come up, and that's whether to verify user identities right when they arrive, or maybe once they're finished and they're ready to actually purchase a plan, only then verifying their identity. So this one way or the other is going to require getting the user's information and checking it against IRS databases to verify their income and see that they're getting the right, like they're eligible for this or that certain subsidy. Different states and the federal exchange approached this design decision differently. On the one hand, verifying upfront could let the website show accurate subsidies without any risk of being accused of lying based off of, if the user enters the wrong thing and then it gets changed once the IRS database says something else. On the other hand, entering the verification information up front might be a bit of a hassle for the users. The federal exchange decided to do the verification up front. So as you could imagine, the site had many moving pieces that needed to be tested. For a project like this, you should test each contractor's module individually and then also see how they interact with each other. But the reality was that testing wasn't nearly as thorough as it should have been. The plan was to handle at least 50,000 users at the same time. Officials claimed that the site was tested for 10,000 concurrent users, but in reality, it was only tested with about 500. Even basic monitoring was lacking. The site didn't have a dashboard to show which pages were being visited or where traffic was spiking. And all they had was a total count of visitors at the end of each day. And when people inside the agency raised concerns, leadership didn't handle it well. So when a CMS engineer emailed internally about some catastrophic build issues that they were seeing in July 2013, the deputy CTO saw it more as an attack and so he asked the contractor to push back instead of like seeing it as an opportunity to like stop the line and escalate the problem and try to get it fixed. That same month, in July 2013, the head of CCIIO commissioned a technical analysis from Turning Point to test the build. The report was very negative, but CCIIO was hopeful that the problems were being fixed by contractors and other CMS offices. Also, as you remember, we saw that in March of 2013, the Secretary of HHS, the head of CMS, and the HHS CTO kind of blew off a McKinsey report about unclear accountability, insufficient time for end-to-end testing, and poor coordination among contractors. They were in the meeting, and especially the head of CMS sort of assured them that like we're this is just sort of uh being blown out of proportion and things will be okay. And so unfortunately none of these different leaders, the CMS head, the CMS deputy CTO, the CCIIO head, the secretary of HHS, none of them really knew of each other's negative reports and that they were all seeing these similar negative findings. So communication breakdowns were plaguing this build, and no one kind of raised their hand and aligned everyone and said, like, we need to fix this ASAP. So, as you can imagine, when the site went live October 1st, 2013, it crashed instantly. It was overwhelmed by over 1 million visits by 7 a.m. The phone lines were jammed. And also, all of this was happening during a government shutdown that started that day. And that made things even harder because many people were furloughed. As we saw earlier, the federal site forced everyone to verify their identity and income with the IRS before browsing plans. But that module was broken, which meant no one could even shop. Worse, there was no dashboard to track traffic or problems in real time. So the team was basically flying blind about where the issue was and what to do about it. But the Secretary of HHS, her boss at the White House was asking what's wrong. So she talked to her engineers and relayed that, well, it seems like it was just high volume traffic and maybe a pipe burst. Meanwhile, states like Kentucky and New York, they also they had their own exchanges. They also went down briefly for an hour or so, maybe a little bit more. But thanks to they had backup servers, they had better processes ready to go. They got back online fast. Kentucky, for instance, they did a lot of things differently. For instance, they let people browse first, and then they verified ID at checkout, and that helped a lot because even when that verification went down briefly, people could still browse, save their plans, and come back later. And that was not the case for healthcare.gov. By the end of day one, only 6 people had enrolled on the federal site, whereas Kentucky had enrolled 1,800. By the second week, it was clear the problems with healthcare.gov went far beyond just high traffic. The CCIIO Tiger team that they had assembled was meeting daily, trying to get a handle of what was going on, but it was pretty chaotic. Adding more servers did not solve the problem. In fact, it just revealed more issues with the underlying software. Identity and citizenship checks were malfunctioning, and status checks from DHS failed entirely. Even basic eligibility stuff was broken, with 75% of Veterans Administration's checks somehow matching to deceased people. On top of that, poorly worded eligibility questions with double negatives, like, are you not incarcerated? Things like that ended up disqualifying many people by mistake. And as the technical failures piled up, the White House was getting more and more frustrated. They realized they couldn't just keep blaming high volume. So the chief of staff, Dennis McDonough, decided to visit CMS in Baltimore himself to try to get some answers. He left pretty rattled because there was still no clear fix in sight, and it was obvious that nobody fully understand how to solve the problems. When the government shutdown ended in October 17th, the national spotlight shifted fully to healthcare.gov and the crisis there. So after a few weeks of chaos, the White House finally brought in outside engineers, which they called the tech surge. Mikey Dickerson from Google, Todd Park, who was the HHS CTO, who was trying to get involved earlier, but was kind of rebuffed from the turf wars. Mike Abbott and some other data geeks. I think maybe even a presidential innovation fellow was on the initial team as well. Were tapped to get healthcare.gov back on track. One of their first moves was talking directly with the engineers at QSSI, the second largest contractor, who did more like a better job than the main contractor to see if those engineers could help them fix the problems. Is this salvageable? The TechSurge team realized that there was no dashboard at all, so they stayed up late and built one overnight. And for the first time, they could see what was happening in real time. They also got a quick technical win by caching common queries. This dropped the average page load times from 8 seconds to just two, which, to be clear, is still quite bad, but it's a huge step forward and was a big morale boost. The volunteers, once they assessed that the website could be salvaged and they would work with QSSI engineers to get it up and running, those volunteers also had to be put on QSSI payroll because they legally couldn't volunteer for the government. With this new approach, they estimated that the site could actually work for most users by the end of November. Mikey Dickerson, the site reliability manager from Google, was put in charge of the rescue effort. Once the rescue operation was underway, the whole approach shifted. The chaotic CCIIO Tiger team was replaced with Mikey Dickerson's daily stand-up meetings, where the team focused on rapid problem solving instead of pointing fingers. They would meet in the morning with the stand-up, go off, solve problems, and then reconvene in the evening to sync and coordinate. Dickerson had three rules for the stand-ups. The war room is for solving problems, not for blame. The ones who should be doing the talking are the people who know the most about an issue and stay focused on the most important issues. Good communication helped identify and prioritize what to work on, whether it was something big like saving user data or adding a back button, or something small like fixing some broken links. At one point, Dickerson even led a round of applause for an engineer who admitted to making a mistake that caused a temporary outage to really just emphasize the blame-free environment so that people could figure out what the issue was and fix it as quickly as possible. Through it all, congressional scrutiny continued, but the technical team kept their eyes on fixing the site. After months of crisis, the tech surge turned healthcare.gov into a functional, reliable website. The team drove site performance way up. Error rates dropped from 6% down to just 0.5%. Page response times dropped from 8 seconds to 0.34 seconds. The uptime jumped from 43% up to 95%. And the site could handle over 50,000 users at once without crashing. The result was a huge surge in enrollment. On December 23rd alone, 129,000 people signed up in that single day, compared to 6 people its first day. And by April 2014, the site had reached 7.1 million enrollments, clearing its initial goal of 7 million. At the same time, Medicaid expansion dramatically improved as like increased enrollment as well, with 4.8 million people gaining coverage during that time, during that first open enrollment period, just through Medicaid expansion. So it was a long journey for the ACA, from years of political fights to a disastrous website launch, its recovery, accumulating in over 10 million people getting health insurance its first year live. And the lessons from this rescue didn't just end there. The same tech team under Mikey Dickerson went on to create the US Digital Service, bringing that focus of problem solving and accountability to other parts of government. Okay, and so that was a start to finish, or at least start to 2014 journey map of the Affordable Care Act. You are now oriented to policymaking and you're experts in healthcare. Let's explore the next case study, which is about getting hospitals to go from paper to digital.